I'm not telling you the Nazis aren't on crack. The Nazis are definitely on crack. The Soviets are also on crack, right? Everybody's on crack. And, you know, the true history of these events is so dark and so useless and so grim and so weird that nobody wants it. And so in a way, if you're basically looking for useful history, you're not going to find that reality. And yet in some ways that reality is actually more useful than these like sort of just so stories. The thing is, you have this dimensional, you know, perception, and you know, in a way, you know, what I kind of want to tell you is you need to abandon your linear Western way of thinking.
Wait, him or me?
Well, everyone.
Okay.
But you definitely need to abandon your liberal, you know. Your linear Western way of thinking. You know, let me you know, give you a brief example of that. You know, I said earlier that you know, it's very frightening to talk about World War II. Let me talk about World War II for a second. So you know, I was in a
that's such a Moldbug thing to say.
You know, I was in a about a couple of years ago. I was in a car, went to visit some right-wing personality whose name I won't mention, in a car with another right-wing personality whose name I won't mention. And on the way back, we fell to talking about World War II. You know, I said to this guy, I was like, you know, in Nuremberg, the Nazis were charged with two great crimes. One of them was plotting to take over the world, and the other one was the mass murder of the, well, actually, people didn't really think of it in ethnic terms at that time, so they just thought crimes against humanity. The idea of the Holocaust, you know, is sort of from the 1970s, and it was like, actually, don't get me wrong, it was like a realization of the truth in the 1970s, but the truth that actually the Holocaust was Jew-specific was actually politically incorrect in the 1940s. If you don't believe me, you can go and watch go on YouTube and watch a wonderful little film called Hitler Lives, 1945, directed by Don Siegel, who later directed Dirty Harry, script by Theodore Geisel, better known as Dr. Seuss. It is an anti-German propaganda film. It is fucking weird.
Dude, that's the biggest red pill of the night right there.
It is fucking
Holy
weird.
Shit.
It is just
I don't even know what you're talking about, but I'll look into it.
It is just weird. It shows you, like, you know, horrors of the Nazis that are absolutely true and genuine, and it does not use the word Jew ever.
So you're saying in the 40s, it was politically incorrect to say that the Holocaust was all about the Jews?
That's correct. The word Holocaust was not used at that time. Far from, and so in a way, like,
we need
part of like modern, you know, Nazi propaganda is basically, you know, the Holocaust is World War II propaganda. And I'm like, no one who had any idea of World War II propaganda would ever say that. You have no clue. So I'm in this car, basically, you know, I'm like, I know more about Hitler than you've forgotten. I've forgotten more about Hitler than you know. Sorry. Another too many shots. You know, so I'm talking to this you know, person who, as you might say, you know, had gone too far, and I'm basically like, you know, at Nuremberg, the Nazis were charged with two great crimes. One of them was plotting to take over the world, and the other one was crimes against humanity. And they were absolutely guilty of one of these crimes and absolutely not guilty of the others. And, you know, this guy's like, you're absolutely right. You know, they were definitely plotting to take over the world, but the Holocaust is totally fake. I'm like, dude, you got it absolutely flipped around. And there's this great Wikipedia page, which is called like Nazi Offensive Plans Controversy. And it was like sort of devoted to the question, which of course, historians have studied the Nazis like ad infinitum, right? They know more about the Nazis than like a proctologist like knows about your colon, right? You know, and you know, like, we have all their files except for the ones they burned. We know everything about the Nazis, and basically everything we know, everything you learn in school about the Nazis is absolutely true. Like, historians have basically a perfect understanding of the Third Reich, contrary to Nazi belief. In this perfect understanding, which of course is faithfully reflected in Wikipedia, you can go to Wikipedia. I believe the title is like Nazi Offensive Plan Strategy or whatever, and you can this page is devoted to like what was the Nazi plan to take over the world. And the evidence for the Nazi plan to take over the world on this page is such as like Hitler built really big buildings, which is characteristics of people who wanted to take over the world, right? You know, and so the thing is, what you'll notice the pattern is here is the truth is not useful to anyone. You know, like, and what Nazis do is they're like, if it was really true that the Holocaust never happened, then everything would be really, really simple. I'm like, that's true. It would be really, really simple. Unfortunately, it's actually really, really complicated. And yet, you know, the whole story of these events that we sort of received history is really just not a true story, but it's not a false story in the obvious ways. It's not a false story in obviously useful ways. You know, if you're like, I mean, any historian who knows the period will agree that, you know, Hitler's fondest lifelong dream was to make an alliance with Great Britain. This is just a historical fact. No historian disagrees about this. You know, and yet, you know, like, it's not useful. It's not like it doesn't change the story of World War II in a way that's like, you know, like useful to like, oh, we got to establish the white ethno-state or some fucking shit, right? And so, you know, you have this situation where you don't really expect that all perspectives on this enormous event that are held today, all perspectives on World War II that are commonly held today, from progressive to Nazi, are just not really well correlated with reality.
Right. It's like what the Nazis actually did was bad enough, but then they have to also create these other layers of even more extreme evil. Like, not only did they kill all these people, but they're also trying to take over the whole world.
Well, no,
and then it has this weird effect of like discrediting and creating these spaces for conspiracy theories.
If you go and watch Hitler Lives, basically the Nazi plan to take over the world is the prominent feature of World War II propaganda. Like, that's what actually people thought when they were fighting this war. We are fighting a war to keep Hitler from taking over the world.
Because American voters wouldn't really give a shit about like actually what they were doing.
Hitler was certainly interested in taking over Eastern Europe. I'll give you that. You know, but like it's a long way from there to the Rio Grande. You know, and actually at the time, at the fall of France, like if you look and read like the New York Times, like American mainstream thinking around the time of the fall of France is like Hitler has conquered France. Therefore, France has colonies in Africa. And therefore, and it's only a little hop from Africa to Brazil. And then once you're in Brazil, the Rio Grande, right? You know? And like you'll go back in history and you'll find people like revered people like George Marshall selling this theory, right? And you're just like this war is fought both sides. Like, I'm not telling you the Nazis aren't on crack. The Nazis are definitely on crack. The Soviets are also on crack, right? Everybody's on crack. And, you know, the true history of these events is so dark and so useless and so grim and so weird that nobody wants it. And so in a way, if you're basically looking for useful history, you're not going to find that reality. And yet in some ways that reality is actually more useful than these like sort of just so stories.
But then people want to produce these moral tales to make it useful for power, and then what ends up happening is that becomes grist for the mill of actually racist, fascist conspiracy theorists who point to this sort of thing as evidence that it's all a lie. Well, you know, the Holocaust didn't really happen.
And what's happening is that these people are basically, you know, I sort of warned people earlier, you know, the thing that's really important not to do is to basically inhabit their caricature of you. And that's exactly what you're doing if you're a Nazi or a white nationalist. I understand that you believe that I'm speaking directly to you now. I understand that you're not in this room. I understand that you believe that you're being like uncompromising and like super metal. Okay, but they're actually like, that is a very one-dimensional way to think, and there are actually much more metal ways to be super metal. And that's what you're doing is basically, look, like, honestly, you know, one thing I was saying to a recent, you know, college graduate earlier, I was like, you know, I graduated from Brown in 1992. I think the level of like, you know, political energy that people get these days in an average American high school, even a red state high school, is about the same level that we got at Brown in 1992. Brown in 2020, I can't even tell you. So people basically are hearing this nonstop, this like strange, these contradictory things. Race exists, race does not exist. You know, race is all important. There's no such thing as race. You know, we need to welcome immigrants, but we're not replacing the population. You know, just like this strange contradictions. You're just like, this is super weird. Like, and like you get this stuff and it doesn't even make sense. And you're like, okay, what's the opposite of this? And that mentality that says, what's the opposite of this? You basically imagine you're like in some session with your like guidance counselor, or you've said a bad word or something, your guidance counselor is talking to you, and you're just like, I hate this person with every bone in my body. What is the opposite of this person? Well, guess what? This person has already told you what the opposite of this person is. It's fucking Hitler. So you're like, how, baby? You know, and the thing is, you have actually failed.
That's so true.
You have actually failed to exit that frame.
That's
you are
so true.
still basically the captive of this guidance counselor. And until you basically are like, no, actually what this person thinks just doesn't matter and isn't related to anything. And actually, I don't know anything. I don't know anything. Let me find out something, right? And instead, it's so much easier to say the Holocaust didn't happen. Well, you know, I have news for you. The Holocaust did happen. And if you disagree with me, I'm happy to come on your podcast and tell you why you're wrong. And
awesome.
And so like this complicated, real, ugly history is not useful to anyone. And yet when you hear it and see it, it rings true in a way that these like fake cardboard things don't. So it's actually in a way more useful.
Right on. Hell yeah.